The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Clara Whitmore remembered the day because she had been in the middle of correcting spelling exercises when the school's errand boy knocked on the classroom door and slid a yellowed envelope across her desk with both hands, the way children presented things they suspected were important. She thanked him. She set the envelope beside the inkwell and finished the lesson. 18 children were waiting to hear whether they had mastered the word necessary, and she was not in the habit of letting the living wait on account of the dead. That evening, in the narrow kitchen of her apartment on Beacon Street, she finally opened it. The return address read, Harlan Whitmore Rancher, Copper Falls, Montana. She held the paper close to the lamp. She had met Harlan Whitmore exactly twice in her life, once at her wedding, when he had shown up unannounced and smelling of horses, and once at James's funeral 3 years ago, when he had pressed her hand and said nothing at all. He had not been unkind. He had simply been the kind of man who did not know what to do with the grief of a woman he barely knew. Now Harlan was dead too. The letter was from his attorney, a Mr. Ellsworth Crane of Copper Falls, Montana, and it informed Clara in the dry language of legal custom that Harlan Whitmore had died intestate and that she was, as the nearest surviving Whitmore relation by marriage, the sole heir to the Whitmore property. The property in question consisted of the ranch house and outbuildings on Copper Creek Road, 14 miles northeast of Copper Falls, and approximately 4,200 acres of grassland, timber, and creek bottomland. Clara read it twice. Then she folded it and sat down at the kitchen table and thought for a long time. The lamp burned low. Somewhere on Beacon Street, a horse-drawn streetcar rumbled past. She could hear her neighbor, Mrs. Adler, moving about overhead, the floor creaking in that familiar pattern Clara had long since memorized. These were the sounds of her life. This apartment, these walls, this city, they had been all she needed, or all she had told herself she needed since James died. James Whitmore, her husband of 6 years, a good man, a quiet man, a man who had loved her with steady, undemonstrative devotion, and who had died at 37 of a fever that the doctors said should not have killed a man so young and strong. She had grieved him honestly and thoroughly, and then she had gone back to teaching because the children needed her, and because she had discovered in the weeks after the funeral that purposeless grief was a thing she could not survive. She had not been to Montana. She had not been west of Albany, if she was being precise about it. She sat looking at the letter and thinking about 4,000 acres, which she could not picture with any accuracy. She had lived in cities all her life, first the modest neighborhood of her childhood in Worcester, then the broader, more elegant world of Boston that James had introduced her to. Her sense of scale was calibrated in city blocks and schoolroom lengths. 4,000 acres was a number without shape. She poured herself a glass of water and looked at the letter again. In the morning, she wrote to Mr. Ellsworth Crane and told him she would be on the train within the fortnight. She had not planned to write that. She had planned to write that she would like further details before making any decisions, which was a sentence that covered her options while revealing nothing. But when she dipped the pen and put it to paper, she wrote what she actually intended, which was that she was coming because she was a woman who had stopped letting caution answer letters on her behalf sometime in the second year of her widowhood. She read over what she had written. Then she posted it. The train west took 4 days. Clara spent most of it at the window watching the country change. The dense green of Massachusetts gave way to flat farmland, then to rolling prairie, then to something she had no word for, a vastness that was not empty so much as it was honest. No clutter. No buildings pressing against one another for warmth, just land and sky and the long, clean line where they met. She had brought 2 trunks. One held her clothes and the small necessities of civilized living. The other held her books and James's journal, which she had not opened in 2 years, and which she brought everywhere out of a loyalty she could not quite name. She knew the kind of woman who carried things she did not yet know what to do with. The dining car was agreeable. She shared a table with a cattle broker from Denver who spoke with authority about beef prices, a minister returning to his parish in Wyoming who was reading Psalms with the slightly desperate concentration of a man who needed them, and a woman named Helen Forsyth who was going to visit her married daughter in Helena and who told Clara 3 times that the winters were nothing to take lightly. Clara assured her all 3 times that she had been warned. She had not been warned. Not really. Warning required imagination, and hers was engaged in other things, in the question of what it meant to own land, to be responsible for land, to stand on 4,000 acres of another country and make a decision about it. She had owned nothing larger than her furniture and her books. The apartment on Beacon Street was rented. Even the things she thought of as hers were, when she examined them, honestly borrowed arrangements. 4,000 acres was another order of existence entirely. At Missoula, a conductor named Perkins told her she was a brave woman for traveling alone. Or a practical one, she said, and he did not seem sure what to make of that. She arrived in Copper Falls on a Thursday morning in late April, when the sky was the blue of a new bruise and the air smelled of pine resin and cold running water. The depot was small, 4 walls and a pot-bellied stove, a sign hand-painted in letters that had begun to bleed at the edges. A man in a heavy coat and spectacles was waiting on the platform with a sign that read Whitmore. This was Mr. Crane. He was older than she had imagined, with the kind of face that had been patient for so long it had forgotten how to be anything else. He had the deliberate manner of a man who had seen too many things too quickly decided and had concluded over a long career that haste was usually the enemy. He helped her with her trunks and led her to a buckboard wagon hitched to a broad-backed gray mare. "I appreciate you making the journey, Mrs. Whitmore," he said once they were seated and the mare had begun her steady walk north on the main road. Harlan didn't have many people. I suspect he wanted to leave things to someone who'd think carefully about what to do with them. "Did you know him well?" 30 years, Crane said. "He was not an easy man, but he was honest. Honest men are rarer in this county than good water." They drove in companionable quiet for a time. The town fell away behind them. She noted a dry goods store, a bank, a hotel with a long porch, 2 saloons whose painted signs caught the morning light without shame. The road climbed gradually through stands of cottonwood and aspen, the new leaves pale and trembling in the morning light, and then opened onto high grassland where the sky pressed down close and enormous. Clara gripped the seat rail. She was not afraid exactly. It was more that the land demanded something of her, some acknowledgement, and she was not sure she had the language for it yet. "You'll want to sell, I expect," Crane said. It was not unkind, just practical. "That's likely the sensible thing," Clara said. "I have a life in Boston, my school, my students." He nodded, eyes on the road. "You should know," he said after a moment, "that you'll have more than one interested party. Benjamin Reed has been inquiring about the Whitmore land for some years now. He's a powerful man in Copper Falls, owns the Broken Spur Ranch to the south and half the main street besides. He'll make you a fair offer, possibly a very generous one. And," Crane glanced at her sidelong, "and there is also a man named Noah Hayes who has been working the Whitmore land these past 4 years. He has no claim to it in law, but he has put considerable labor into maintaining it. You ought to hear what he has to say before you make any decisions." She filed this away. She was a schoolteacher. She was accustomed to hearing all sides before she spoke. They rode another 3 miles before she saw it. The Whitmore ranch house stood on a rise above a creek whose name she did not yet know. It was not grand. The house was solid log construction with a wide front porch, the wood weathered to the color of old silver, the porch boards warped in 2 or 3 places by decades of freeze and thaw. Behind the house rose a barn, red paint faded to pink, and a smaller outbuilding, and a series of corrals built from lodgepole pine that formed a rough series of enclosures beyond the barn. Beyond all of it stretched the landgrass and sage, the dark rim of timber on the ridge above, and in the middle distance, the shining thread of what she supposed must be Copper Creek. Clara sat in the wagon and looked at it for a long moment. She was trying to understand how something could feel entirely foreign and at the same moment strangely inevitable. She had the peculiar sense of arriving somewhere she had been traveling toward without knowing it, the way you sometimes look back and see the shape of choices that appeared at the time to have no shape at all. Crane helped her down and carried her smaller trunk to the porch. He was explaining something about the water rights when she heard footsteps on the hard ground and turned. The man coming from the direction of the barn walked with the economical stride of someone who covered ground all day and saw no reason to waste energy doing it. He was tall and lean with the kind of sunburned face that comes from years of outdoor work rather than vanity, and dark eyes that made their assessment of her in the first second and then moved away with the same courtesy. He wore a battered hat pulled low against the morning glare, a canvas jacket that had been mended at both elbows, and work-worn boots that told a story of serious use. He stopped a respectful distance from the porch and removed his hat. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. His voice was low and even. "Mr. Hayes," she said, because she could see it in the set of his shoulders, the careful way he held himself. The particular combination of steadiness and restraint that comes from a man who has taught himself not to want too much. He looked momentarily surprised that she had guessed his name. Then the surprise closed over smooth as water. "I've been keeping the place going," he said. "I wanted to let you know before anything gets decided that the cattle are all healthy. Fence line on the south quarter needs work. The creek's running clean." It was a report, not a plea. That interested her. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes," she said. "I'll want to see the place properly before I make any decisions." He nodded. He looked at Crane. "Her room is aired out," he said, then put his hat back on and walked back toward the barn without another word. Clara watched him go. "He's been sleeping in the barn," Crane said quietly. "His own choice. He has a place in town, but he's been here every day since Harlan died, keeping things running." "Why?" Crane was quiet for a moment. "You'll have to ask him that yourself. He is not the sort of man who answers questions he hasn't been asked." He helped her with her trunks, showed her through the ranch house, which was spare and clean and smelled of pine and old wood smoke, and something she could not name, but which she later decided was simply the smell of a place that had been lived in with care, and then left her with his card and the instruction to send word to his office in town whenever she was ready to discuss matters. She stood in the kitchen after he had gone, listening to the sound of the wagon retreating down the road, and then to the silence that came after it. It was not an empty silence. It was full of the creek and the wind, and somewhere above her head, a bird she could not identify. She unpacked her smaller trunk and made a cup of tea on the wood stove, which took her 3 tries to light, and which she regarded as a challenge she intended to master. She slept better than she expected to in a strange bed in a strange land. The mattress was old but clean. The window faced east, and in the morning, the early light lay in long, pale bars across the quilt, and she could hear the creek below the ridge, a low, persistent sound like a conversation happening in the next room. She lay still for a while, listening. In Boston, the mornings began with carriage wheels and voices and the clatter of commerce. Here there was only wind and water, and somewhere below her window, the chickadee-dee-dee of a small bird she could not name. She dressed and went downstairs to find coffee already made on the stove. There was no one in the kitchen. The coffee pot was hot, and beside it sat a plate of biscuits covered with a cloth. She stood at the window and ate, standing up, looking out over the corrals to where Noah Hayes was already at work mending a section of fence, moving with the unhurried competence of a man who knew exactly what needed doing and was simply doing it. The fences ran in long, pale lines away from the barn, defining the edges of pasture she could not see the far end of. The mountains beyond the timber were still snow-capped, brilliant white against the April blue, and the whole scene had the quality of something she might have found in a painting too large, too composed, too deliberately beautiful to be real. But the coffee was real, and the biscuits were real, and the man mending fence in the pale morning light was real. She poured a second cup of coffee and carried it outside. He heard her coming, or perhaps he simply sensed her, the way animals sense a change in the air, and turned before she reached him. She held out the cup. He looked at it for a moment, then took it. "Thank you," he said. "The biscuits are very good," she said. "Did you make them?" "There's a woman in town, Mrs. Alderman. She brings things by sometimes." He said it the way he said most things, as plain information, no ornamentation. She stood beside him and looked at the fence. The posts were lodgepole pine, the wire strung taut between them. He had been pulling staples from a rotted post and was in the process of setting a new one, and she could see by the way the repaired sections ran in clean, tight lines away from him that he had been at this for some weeks, working steadily from east to west. "How much of the fence line has been done already?" she asked. He looked at her with something that was not quite surprise. "About half the south quarter. The north pasture is in better shape. The soil's softer up there, posts don't heave as much in the frost." "Do you need help?" A long pause. He took a drink of coffee, eyes on the middle distance, as if consulting the fence itself. "I do not," he said, "require help. That isn't what I asked." Another pause, shorter this time. "I could use a second person to hold the post while I drive it," he said very carefully, as if each word cost something. "Then tell me what to do," Clara said. He looked at her for a moment longer, assessing in the way he had at first introduction, but with something slightly different behind it now. She let him look. "Put your gloves on first," he said. She wore her heaviest gloves and got splinters in both of them before noon. She learned to brace the post at the exact angle he specified. She had tried twice to improvise, and twice he had corrected her without impatience, as if the post's stubbornness were a problem they were solving together rather than a failure on her part. By mid-morning, she was sweating inside her coat, and her lower back had registered a formal complaint, and she was more absorbed in the problem of fence building than she had been in anything since the last school examination. She asked questions. He answered them. Gradually, she learned that a fence post needed to be set at least 2 feet deep in this soil, that the wire needed to be strung tight enough to hold, but not so tight it would snap in the cold, that the proper gauge of wire for cattle was different from what you'd use for horses, that certain posts always heaved in frost country, and you set them deeper to compensate. He spoke about these things with quiet authority, not condescension. She understood that this was the way he communicated through the doing of things, not the explaining of them. He was not withholding. He was translating, and he had only learned to translate into action. She found she understood that language well enough. Around noon, they stopped for the biscuits she had brought out in her coat pocket, and they ate sitting on the fence rail in a silence that had become in the space of 4 hours comfortable. The kind of silence that only exists between people who have worked together long enough to have no pressing social obligations toward each other. "You've never worked land before," he said. It wasn't a question. "I have not," she agreed. "You catch on quick." She understood from him that this was a significant observation. She did not make too much of it. "Mr. Hayes," she said after a moment, "why have you been keeping this place running? Mr. Crane tells me you have no legal claim to it." He turned the last biscuit in his hands for a moment before eating it. "I made a promise," he said. He said nothing further. "To Harlan, no." He looked out at the land. "To someone else." She waited. He did not elaborate, and she understood that the topic was not closed so much as sealed, kept under pressure, and she was not yet a person he trusted enough to release it to. Fair enough. She had known him for approximately 5 hours. "I appreciate what you've done here," she said. "It needed doing," he said. He stood up and put his hat back on. "There are 2 hours of good light left." She stood too. They worked until the light went amber and long, and she drove one good post herself by the end, with Noah's hands steadying the post at the base, while she swung the mallet, and the post went in plumb, and she stepped back and looked at it with the satisfaction of a thing done right. "Good," he said. She thought later that there might not be a better word in his vocabulary. The second visitor arrived the next afternoon. Clara was in the ranch house kitchen attempting to decode the logic of a wood-burning stove she had never encountered before, a large iron contraption with opinions about damper positions that she had not yet learned to respect when she heard the sound of hoofbeats. Not one horse, several. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to the door. The man coming up the road rode a dark bay horse with the kind of effortless authority that suggested he had been on horseback since before he could walk. He was perhaps 40, with a square jaw and the particular easy confidence of a man who had never needed to try very hard to make an impression. His coat was well cut, his boots clean despite the road, and there was something in the arrangement of these details that told her he had thought about them, which was itself a kind of information. Behind him came 2 hired hands trailing at a respectful distance that was clearly habitual. He dismounted smoothly and removed his hat with a gesture that managed to be both courteous and practiced, as if he were accustomed to presenting himself well, and had concluded that this was simply good manners rather than performance. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, and his voice had a rich, warm quality, the voice of a man who was good at talking and knew it. "I'm Benjamin Reed. Welcome to Montana. I hope you'll forgive the intrusion. I wanted to extend my welcome before the week was out." He had good teeth and a good suit and an easy, pleasant smile that had clearly served him well for a great many years. "Mr. Reed," Clara said. She did not step back from the doorway, but she did not open it further. "Mr. Crane mentioned your name." "I imagine he did." He smiled again. "I'll come to the point, Mrs. Whitmore, because I expect you're a practical woman and we're wasting each other's time if I'm not direct. I've had my eye on the Whitmore land for some years. It borders my south pasture, and the water rights on Copper Creek would be valuable to my operation. I'm prepared to make you a very good offer." "How good?" He named a number. It was, she had to admit, considerably more than she had expected. More she suspected than the land was strictly worth at current prices. "That's a generous offer," she said. "It's a fair one," he said with the confidence of a man who believed there was no meaningful difference between the two. The land would be in good hands and you'd be free to return to Boston with more resources than you left with. Win all around. He said it cheerfully, as if the thing were already agreed and they were simply working through the formality of paperwork. She noticed this. I appreciate the offer, Clara said. I need some time to think. Something moved behind his eyes, a flicker quickly covered. Of course, no rush. He said it in a way that suggested the opposite. A week, she said. I'll give you an answer in a week. Splendid. He put his hat back on and was already turning back to his horse. In the meantime, I hope you'll allow me to show you some hospitality. Dinner at the Broken Spur any evening you like. I'll let you know, she said. She watched him ride back down the road, the two hired men following. She stood on the porch for a moment, thinking about the quality of his smile, genuine enough, but directed like a lamp turned to illuminate exactly what he wanted her to see, and perhaps not what was behind it. Behind her, from the direction of the barn, she heard Noah Hayes's hammer strike steady as a clock, and somehow the comparison was unavoidable. That evening, over a meal of beans and salt pork, she had cooked herself with uneven results. The salt pork had gone slightly leathery from inattention, and the beans were better than she expected. Clara asked Noah Hayes about the water rights. He was eating across the table from her, which had taken some persuasion on her part. His instinct was to eat alone, or perhaps to eat in the barn, and she had simply set two plates and looked at him in a way that left no reasonable alternative, and he had come in and sat and removed his hat and hung it on the back of the chair with an air of a man accepting a situation gracefully. The creek cuts through the northeast corner of your land before it crosses onto Reed's South pasture, he said. He's been after those water rights for 6 years, best I know. Harlan wouldn't sell. Why not? Ask a man why he won't part with something he values. Most times, you don't get a straight answer. He considered his beans. Harlan was particular about this land. He had his reasons. Did you like Harlan? He took his time with that. He was fair. He didn't waste words. He paused. We understood each other well enough. Clara thought about that. She thought about two men who communicated in silence and practical action, sharing the same land in some arrangement she didn't fully understand yet. Did he know my husband? The question came out before she had fully decided to ask it. She watched Noah Hayes's face very carefully. He was still for a moment, just a beat too long. He did, Noah said, in a manner of speaking. What manner? He set his fork down. He looked at his plate, then at the wall, then at her, and the sequence of it told her that what he was about to say was something he had been turning over for a long time, weighing it, considering when and how and whether. Your late husband came here once, he said. To Montana, to this place. He paused, and he left behind a secret. Clara did not move. What kind of secret? She said very quietly. That, Noah Hayes said, is something I should show you, not tell you. He stood, picked up his plate, and carried it to the basin. But not tonight. Give me a few days. She wanted to press. She was not by nature a patient woman when she sensed there was something to understand. But she had also been a teacher long enough to know that the right moment for certain revelations was not always the moment you most wanted them, and that pushing too hard too fast was the surest way to get a door closed in your face. All right, she said, a few days. He washed his own plate, set it to dry, thanked her for the meal with a brief courtesy that was genuine if sparse, and went out to the barn. Clara sat alone at the table for a long time, listening to the creek and thinking about James. James had been here, in this place at this table, or a table like it in this kitchen, breathing this air. She had not known. He had never told her. He had gone west when she cast her mind back. In the autumn of 1890, he had gone to look at a business opportunity, he had said. In Denver, he had said. He had never mentioned Montana. She sat with that for a long time, feeling the distance between what she had known and what she had not known widen into something that required new maps. She was not angry. James had been a careful man, a private man in some particular ways. He had carried troubles alone and presented her with solutions which she had appreciated and also on reflection gently resented, because she was a capable woman and would have wanted to carry things beside him. But she could not be angry with a man 3 years dead. She could only be curious. She got up, washed her own plate, and went to bed. She lay awake for some time listening to the creek and thinking about the woman who had not known, and the woman she was becoming here in this place her husband had loved in secret. The days had a rhythm to them that Clara had not expected. She woke before 6, which was earlier than she ever woke in Boston, but which the rooster in the yard made inevitable. She made coffee. She looked out the east window at the light coming over the ridge, a thin, fierce line at first, then a broad spreading of gold that turned the frost on the grass into something that looked for 10 minutes like scattered diamonds. Then she dressed in the most practical things she owned, a dark wool skirt, a plain shirtwaist, her heaviest boots, and went to see what the day required of her. There was always something, a calf that had worked its way through a weak section of fence and needed driving back, water to be hauled from the creek before the pump thawed out in the afternoon heat, the stove's firebox to be cleaned and reset, a procedure she had learned through trial and considerable smoke. She made mistakes regularly and corrected them without fuss, which seemed to be the unspoken standard on the Whitmore land. Noah was always there before her. She would find him already at work at the barn or the fence line, or down at the creek where he was making slow progress on repairs to a small wooden dam that controlled the flow into the pasture water trough. He acknowledged her arrival with a brief nod and then absorbed her into whatever he was doing, explaining what needed explaining and otherwise letting the work speak for itself. She realized being taught something. He just wasn't making it obvious. He was not a natural teacher. He did not structure things in sequence or break down a task into its component parts the way she did in a classroom. He simply did things alongside her and assumed she was paying attention, which she was. "Show me how to bridle a horse," she said one morning standing in the barn doorway while he saddled the blue roan gelding he called Patch. He looked at her steadily for a moment, reading something in the request she hadn't put there consciously. Then he stepped back from Patch and held the bridle out to her. "This is the head stall," he said. "These are the cheek pieces. This is the bit. Don't let him get his lips over it sideways or he'll fight you. Stand at his left shoulder. He needs to feel where you are." She stood at Patch's left shoulder. The horse turned his head and regarded her with one enormous dark eye. "I feel you inspecting me," she told the horse. Patch huffed through his nose. "He doesn't care about your qualifications," Noah said from somewhere behind and to her right. "He cares whether you know what you're doing." "That seems reasonable," Clara said. She lifted the bridle. Patch lowered his head with surprising cooperation, and she navigated the bit and head stall through 3 adjustments before Noah reached past her shoulder, not touching her, just extending one hand to show her how the throat latch should lie. His proximity lasted perhaps 2 seconds. He was close enough that she could smell leather and wood smoke and the particular mineral smell of cold mornings. Then he stepped back. "Better," he said. "Do it again." She did it again and again. By the 3rd time, Patch no longer bothered to turn his head and inspect her. He simply waited, patient as weather. "He's accepted me," she said. "He's decided you're competent enough not to cause him problems," Noah said. "It's a practical arrangement." She laughed. It surprised both of them a little. He looked away quickly back at the saddle he'd been adjusting, and she understood that he was not accustomed to laughter in the barn and was not sure what to do with it. She filed that away along with the observation that his face was more open when he was not trying to manage it. Benjamin Reed came by again on the 4th day. This time he came alone, and he brought with him a bunch of early wildflowers from somewhere, blue commas, and yellow biscuit root tied with a strip of calico, which was either charming or calculated, and she hadn't yet decided which. He handed them to her on the porch with a smile that reached his eyes, which was a thing she watched for. "You look like you've been working," he said. There was no censure in it. He said it with something that was almost admiration. "I have been," she said. "Come in. I'll make coffee." He came in. He sat at the kitchen table with the ease of a man used to sitting in other people's kitchens and making himself comfortable there. And he talked about Copper Falls, the new schoolhouse being built on Cherry Street, the trouble with the railroad over freight rates, the dry winter they'd had, and what it might mean for summer water. He was interesting. She had not expected that, or rather, she had not expected it to matter to her. He was well-traveled, well-read, and he had opinions he offered confidently, but without insisting she share them, which she found she appreciated. "Your uncle had a fine operation here," he said. "He was stubborn about the creek rights, but he ran good cattle." "He wasn't my uncle," she said. "He was my late husband's uncle. I met him twice." "And yet he left you everything." "And yet," she agreed. He looked at her with an attention that was both flattering and slightly exhaustive. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect? A woman who wanted to conclude the business as quickly as possible. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. You seem curious about the place. I am curious about most things, she said. It's an occupational hazard. He smiled. A schoolteacher's habit. A person's habit, she said. I was curious before I was a teacher. He laughed genuinely, and she noted that his laugh was easy and unguarded, which made her like him a little more than she had intended to. I heard you've been working fence with Hayes, he said at some point, easy as anything. I have, she said. He's a good worker. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. Stubborn, but good. He paused, and she felt the weight of what he was about to say before he said it. You know he has no legal standing on this land. Whatever arrangement he had with Harlan, it died with Harlan. I know, she said. I'm not trying to make trouble, he said. I just want you to understand that when you sell, you'll need to make sure any informal arrangements are settled before the papers are signed. He was right, and she knew it, and somehow that made her more uncomfortable rather than less. I haven't decided to sell, she said. A pause, brief, but she caught it. A small recalculation quickly managed. Of course, he said. He smiled. Take all the time you need. After he left, she stood at the window and watched his horse move down the road, a clean, dark shape against the pale spring grass. Then she went back to the stove and the dinner she had been making, and she thought about the difference between a man who made things easy and a man who made things true. She thought about that for a while. The first riding lesson happened by accident. She had been watching Noah work with a 2-year-old filly in the small round pen behind the barn, a bay creature with a white star on her forehead and an opinion about everything, who had so far refused to accept the saddle with any grace. The filly shied from the blanket, kicked at the saddle, and expressed her feelings about the girth with a series of dramatic sideways steps that would have been comical if she had been less large. Noah was patient with her in a way that was instructive to watch. He made no sudden movements, issued no corrections, louder than necessary, and when the filly shied from the saddle blanket for the 4th time, he simply went back to the beginning and started over without a trace of frustration. He was methodical. He did not punish the filly for her fear. He simply kept offering the thing until she ran out of objections. You don't punish her for being afraid, Clara said through the fence rails. He glanced over. What would be the point? She doesn't understand why she should trust the blanket. She just knows it's strange. You don't fix fear with punishment. No, Clara agreed. She had spent 11 years in front of classrooms full of children who were afraid of something arithmetic or public reading or other children. You don't. He looked at her for a moment, and something in his expression considered and then resolved. Do you want to try Patch, he said. He's easy. He'll teach you more than I can explain. That was how she found herself on horseback for the first time in her adult life, walking slow circles around the yard while Noah stood in the center and gave instructions in the same even tone he used for everything. The first lesson was humbling. She gripped too hard with her knees, which made her thighs ache within 20 minutes. She pulled back on the reins at the wrong moments, which caused Patch to break and toss his head in mild protest. She looked down at the ground instead of where she was going, which Noah corrected 3 times with brief instruction before she managed to keep her eyes up. Relax your hands, he said. He can feel everything you're doing. If you're tense, he's tense. Easy for you to say. He won't dump you. He's too polite for that. A pause. Relax your hands. She breathed out and deliberately unclenched her fingers on the reins and felt the difference immediately. Patch's back shifted under her, a small releasing of tension that she could feel all the way up through her seat, and he settled into a walk that was suddenly smooth and purposeful. Oh, she said. There it is, Noah said. There was a quiet satisfaction in it. They went around the yard 4 more times before he told her that was enough for the first day. She was surprised to find she was disappointed. She had been absorbed these last 20 minutes in the problem of communication, of learning to speak a language composed entirely of weight and pressure and the angle of one's hips, and the interruption felt abrupt. He helped her down from Patch standing at the horse's head while she found the mounting block and managed the dismount on her own. Tomorrow we'll work on posting, he said. I'll look forward to it. She said, meaning it. He took Patch back to the barn. She stood in the yard and noticed that her legs were shaking slightly from the unfamiliar exertion and that she did not mind this at all. She had gone soft in Boston, or had not known she was soft because Boston had never required anything else of her. She was discovering with some frequency what she was actually made of. On the 6th evening after her arrival, she found James's journal. She had been going through the small writing desk in the ranch house parlor, trying to make sense of Harlan Whitmore's papers. Deeds, water agreements, old letters, a hand-drawn map of the property lines that had been corrected in several places with different ink, when her hand encountered a slim leather-bound volume tucked at the very back of the bottom drawer, underneath a folded piece of oilskin that had been placed there deliberately as if someone were trying to protect it. She knew the journal immediately. She had given it to James as a birthday gift in 1888. He had carried it in his coat pocket for 2 years, filling it with the small observations of a man who thought carefully about everything and wrote carefully 2 spare declarative sentences that caught the thing exactly as it was, without any of the ornamentation she sometimes wished he had been less precise about. She sat very still for a moment, holding it. The lamp on the writing desk threw a warm circle of light. Outside, the evening wind was moving through the cottonwoods. In the kitchen, she could hear the stove settling. Then she opened it. The first 2/3 were familiar. She had seen some of these entries before. He had read her passages sometimes in the evenings after supper, with a certain diffidence that she had found endearing. She could hear his voice in the careful handwriting. Boston, the autumn of 1890. A dinner with colleagues. A difficult conversation with his employer about a contract that had not gone as planned. A cold she had caught that he worried about more than she did, which was his way. He worried about her health and said so in writing while saying very little about his own. Then the entries changed. October 14th, 1890. Arrive Billings. The country is tremendous. I had no sense of the scale of it from any description I have read. It makes a man feel the right size, which is small. I find I do not mind this. I have been feeling too large for my troubles. October 17th. Copper Falls. I should have come here sooner. Harlan Whitmore is a harder man than I expected, but a fair one. His land is extraordinary. I understand now why he has never left it. October 21st. I owe Noah Hayes my life. I cannot put a finer point on it. The river crossing, I misread the current and went under, and he came in after me without a second's hesitation. A man I had known for 4 days. I don't know how to account for it. He simply did not consider not doing it. I have been thinking about this for 3 days, and I cannot improve upon that explanation. Clara read that line 3 times. October 23rd. Spoke with Noah for a long time tonight. He is the kind of person you trust without knowing why. He has had difficulty that he carries quietly, which is the best way to carry it, but it shows sometimes in his eyes when he doesn't know you're looking. He is not unhappy. He has something else waiting perhaps, though, for what I could not tell you. I told him about Clara. I don't know why I told him. It seemed like the thing to say. I described her with what felt like inadequate precision, and he listened the way he listens to everything, which is completely. I told him I don't know why I told him this. It seemed like the truth, that if anything ever happens to me, to look after Clara, if she ever comes here. He said he would. He said it the way some men shake hands, like the words were a physical thing that existed in the world after you spoke them. The lamp had burned low. Clara sat in the near dark with the journal open in her lap and her hands still and her heart doing something complicated in her chest. He had been here. He had stood where she was standing, or in this room in this house. He had breathed this air. He had sat by some fire with Noah Hayes and spoken about her, described her with what felt like inadequate precision, which was the most James thing she had ever read in her life. He would have worried about getting her right. He would have been dissatisfied with his own description. She sat for a long time with the journal open and the lamp burning down. She had not known. She had not known where he had gone in October 1890, not truly. She had accepted Denver. She had been 31 years old and busy with her school and comfortable in the trust that James would tell her what he wanted to tell her, because she had believed in the general adequacy of what they told each other, which she could see now was a kind of comfortable blindness. She was not angry. She was simply learning the shape of a thing she had thought she knew, and finding it was larger and more particular than she'd understood. She closed the journal very gently. She went to bed. She did not sleep immediately. In the morning, she was quiet over breakfast in a way that no one noticed without remarking on. He poured her coffee and ate his own meal with his customary focus on the immediate task, and he left her to her thoughts, which she appreciated more than she could have explained. It was not until they were out by the creek working on the dam repairs, a task that required both of them, her holding boards in place while he drove nails with careful, measured strokes, that she said carefully, "James was here in October of 1890. Noah stopped driving the nail. He held the hammer loosely, looking at the board she was pressing against the frame. He mentioned the river, she said. A long silence. Water ran past them cold and clear, making that low, constant sound. A dipper flicked across the surface upstream. He was a good swimmer, Noah said at last. Better than he thought. But the current at the ford was treacherous that day. We both knew it, and we went anyway because we were on the wrong side of it and needed to cross. A pause. He went under and I went in. He wrote about it, she said. He said he told you if he ever died to look after me if I came here. Noah drove the nail. Once, twice, the sound of it carrying clean in the cold morning air. He did, he said. You never met me before last week, she said. You had no reason to think I'd ever come. He thought you might. He picked up another nail from the can beside him. He spoke about you. Enough that I thought you would come eventually if things changed. He pressed the next board into place without looking at her. I didn't know how long I'd wait. You waited 4 years, she said. I gave Harlan my word too, he said, to keep the place going. It wasn't just... He stopped. It wasn't only about you, he said, which she understood meant it was at least partly about her, and that admitting even that much had cost him something he was still accounting for. They worked in silence for a while. The creek ran. A meadowlark called from somewhere up the bank, a liquid, extravagant sound, the kind of sound that seemed too beautiful for a Tuesday morning, but which happened anyway because beauty doesn't wait for significance. Why didn't you tell me right away, she asked. He drove the last nail home before answering. Because I didn't know you, he said. James talked about you, but that's different from knowing a person. I wanted to see what kind of woman you were before I handed you something like that. She thought about that. And he picked up the can of nails and stood and looked at her with those dark, steady eyes. The morning light was full on his face. You held that post right, he said, even when it was heavy. She understood that he was not speaking entirely about fence posts. She understood it and accepted it, and felt in accepting it the particular warmth of being seen accurately by someone who had been paying close attention. She sent a letter to her school explaining that she would be away longer than expected. She sat at the writing desk the same evening she decided to send it before she could talk herself out of it, and she wrote to Mrs. Hatch with the directness she had learned from James, and that James had apparently learned in part from this place. I find the property requires more time to assess than I anticipated, she wrote. She stopped, reread this sentence, and crossed it out. Then she started again. I find I am not ready to leave, she wrote. I will return before the school year begins if possible. If not, I trust your judgment about the class. This was closer to the truth, and she let it stand. Benjamin Reed hosted a dinner on Friday evening at the Broken Spur, and Clara went because it was the proper thing to do, and because she was curious about the kind of life he was offering her the chance to see. The Broken Spur Ranch was something else from the Whitmore place, twice the size or more, with a house that had glass in all its windows, and a parlor with a chandelier that caught the candlelight and scattered it in small constellations across the ceiling. There was a carved mahogany staircase going up to the second floor, and a dining room table long enough to seat 12, and the whole house had the air of money that had been spent not just in comfort, but in the careful communication of standing. The dinner table was full. The county clerk, the local banker, the doctor, and his wife, 2 men whose importance in the region Clara gathered from the way Benjamin moved around them, attentive without being servile, which was a difficult line to walk, and he walked it well. He sat her at his right hand and spent the evening being impeccably attentive. He asked about Boston, thoughtful questions, not the usual idle curiosity about the size of the city or the winters. He had read many of the same books she had. He laughed at the right things. When the conversation turned to matters she knew nothing about, cattle prices, railroad agreements, he explained without being condescending. She found herself enjoying the evening more than she had expected to, which made her suspicious of herself. You're thinking, he said during a lull after the main course. I'm always thinking, she said, about the land. Among other things, he leaned slightly toward her. It was subtle, the sort of movement that conveyed interest without presupposing anything. I want you to know that I meant what I said about it being a fair offer. Not just financially, the whole situation. You'd have no worries, no complications. You could go back to your life in Boston or... He paused, and she sensed the precision with which he chose his next words. And I want to say this carefully, you could stay in Copper Falls. Build something. There are more options available to a woman of means in this territory than you might expect. He was looking at her with a steadiness that was different from Noah's steadiness, warmer at the surface, more readily available, but somehow she couldn't see all the way through it to whatever was underneath. That's a generous thought, she said. Clara. He used her name with the ease of a man who rarely asked permission for things. I'll be entirely honest with you. I think you're remarkable. The way you've taken to this place, what I hear about, how you've thrown yourself into learning the land that's not common. Most women in your position would have sold by telegram and never come at all. He paused. I don't want you to go. I want you to stay. And I want you to know that if you sold me the land and stayed in Copper Falls, I would do everything in my power to make you glad you did. It was a very nearly perfect thing to say. She appreciated the craft of it, even as she felt the distance between them, the way she could admire the architecture of a statement while not quite believing it. Thank you, she said. You've given me a great deal to think about. He smiled and filled her wine glass and gracefully changed the subject, and she sat at his beautifully appointed table for another 2 hours and talked about books and territorial politics and the construction of the new schoolhouse on Cherry Street. She rode home by herself under a sky dense with stars, her lantern throwing a small yellow circle on the road ahead. Patch moved under her with the comfortable reliability she had come to depend on in the past week, his hoofbeats steady on the packed dirt. Montana at night was something she was still learning to be in the presence of. The stars here were not the few respectable pinpoints visible between Boston's rooftops. They were numberless and extravagant, sprawling across the sky in great rivers and clusters. So many of them that the darkness seemed like the minority position, the stars, the overwhelming majority opinion about the nature of things. She had stopped the first night she'd seen them and simply looked up for several minutes standing in the yard in the cold, feeling something open in her chest that she didn't have a clean name for. Not grief, though, grief was in it somewhere. Not joy, though that was in it too. Something larger than either, something more like the recognition of one's actual scale in the world, which was smaller and less important, and somehow on that first night, and on this one, riding home under them deeply unexpectedly comforting. She was thinking about that when she came up the road to the ranch house and saw the light in the barn. She put Patch away, feeding him, cooling him down, hanging his tack in the order she had learned with the methodical care that Noah had taught her, and then crossed the yard to the barn. The light was a lantern hanging from a nail, and Noah was there awake, at 11 o'clock at night, sitting on an overturned bucket beside the stall of the bay filly, who was not well. What's wrong with her? Clara said, stopping in the barn doorway. Colic, maybe, Noah said. He had his hand flat against the filly's flank, feeling. Gut sounds are off. I've been walking her every half hour. Can I help? He looked at her. She was still in her dinner clothes, her good green dress, her best boots, and said nothing about it. Just moved aside to make room. She took the filly's lead rope and walked her the length of the barn and back and again, keeping her moving, keeping her from lying down. The horse was dull-eyed and uncomfortable, turning her head occasionally to look at her own flank in that particular pained way that animals have when they cannot locate the source of their own distress. Clara kept her voice low and steady, talking nonsense, mostly about the stars she had just ridden under, about the dinner she had eaten, about the schoolhouse in Copper Falls that was being built with good pine boards and would have glass in 3 of its windows. The horse didn't need to understand the words. She needed to hear a calm voice in the dark. Noah checked on her every few passes. He was running on no sleep. She could see that there was a weariness around his eyes that he was managing through sheer practice. You've been up all night, she said. Since about midnight, he admitted. It was past 2 now. Sit down, she said. I'll keep walking her. Tell me what to watch for. He looked at her steadily for a moment, and she could see the particular struggle in him, the instinct to manage things himself against the practical intelligence that recognized when an offer was sound. She tries to lie down. Come get me immediately, he said. Other than that, just keep her moving. Don't let her stand. He sat on the bucket and rested his forearms on his knees, watching. Within 20 minutes, she could see his head beginning to dip. She kept walking, the filly steady and patient, making slow turns at each end of the barn. Around 3 in the morning, the filly's gut sounds came back. The horse stopped trying to look at her flank. Her eyes cleared. She pushed her nose against Clara's coat pocket, looking for treats she wasn't going to find, and Clara pressed her forehead briefly against the horse's and breathed in the warm horse smell and felt something uncomplicate itself in her chest. She's through it. Noah said. He had snapped awake when the filly stopped with the particular alertness of a man who had trained himself to sleep lightly. She is, Clara agreed. They stood on either side of the filly in the lamplight, and the horse stood between them, drooping with relief, and the barn was quiet around them. You should sleep, Clara said. So should you. He paused. Thank you for staying. I didn't stay, she said. I came back and found you needed help. That's different. He looked at her with that particular expression she had begun to recognize, the one where he was saying something with his face that he wouldn't say with words. She was getting better at reading it. Still, he said. Good night, Mr. Hayes, she said. Good night, Mrs. Whitmore, he said. She walked back to the house under the fading stars, her good dress faintly dusty from the barn floor, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time, the specific satisfaction of having been somewhere she was needed and having stayed. The following morning she was up early despite the short night. She made coffee and took it to the porch and sat on the step in the pale first light, and she opened James's journal again to the Montana entries. She read them more slowly this time, without the shock of discovery to rush her through them. She read the way she read anything important, with the full attention of a teacher, which is the attention of someone who has learned that what is between the lines is often the more essential text. James had been happy here in those October weeks. Happier, she thought, reading carefully than he had been in Boston in a long time. Not that he had been unhappy at home, she would have known, or she believed she would have known, but here he had been something different, lighter, more himself in a way that suggested that in Boston he had been carrying a weight he had become so accustomed to that he no longer noticed its pressure. She sat with that for a long time. Then she read the final entry. October 28th, 1890. Clara, if you ever read this, and I don't know that you will, I may carry this journal to my grave and leave you wondering where I went wrong, which is the kind of worry I cannot stop, even when I know it is groundless. I want you to understand why I didn't tell you. I came here because I was afraid. The business with Harrington was going badly, and I had borrowed against our savings, and I don't know what I needed. To think, to be somewhere the problem couldn't follow me. I found something I did not expect. I found a place that feels like the truth, and a man who saved my life without being asked to, and the certain knowledge that if things had gone another way, you would have been all right. Noah Hayes would have made sure of it. I will tell you all of this when I get home. I am certain of it. I will tell you about the river and the stars and Harlan Whitmore's extraordinary land and the man who keeps it running like it matters. I always mean to tell you everything. You know that. I just get home and you're there and the city is there, and it all seems like something from another country. Tell Noah I said thank you, if you ever get the chance. Clara closed the journal. The light had come fully up over the ridge. The meadowlark was singing again. She could hear Noah in the barn, the sound of the water bucket, the low settled sound of horses being fed. She sat on the porch step and pressed her hand flat against the cover of the journal for a long time, as if she could feel the warmth of him still in it. She had been a widow for 3 years, and she had made her peace, as people say, with being one. She had not thought that peace would be complicated by this, by learning him better here in Montana than she had known him in Boston, by finding the version of him that had been happy in a way she had not seen clearly enough to name while he was alive. But she was not, she thought, looking out at the mountain ridge with the meadowlark still going as undone by this as she might have been. She was something else. Grateful, maybe. Grateful that he had come here. Grateful that he had been happy for those October weeks. Grateful that he had made a promise to a man he'd known for 4 days, because he was the kind of man who made promises he intended to keep. She got up and went inside and started breakfast. She had a ranch to learn to run. May arrived with warmth that was still thin at the edges, the way early spring warmth always is in high country, generous in the afternoon, apologetic by sundown. The grass in the upper pasture had come in strong, knee-high in the shelter of the ridge's southern exposure, shorter and greener in the open flats where the wind had its way. The cattle, 22 head of mixed stock that Harlan had left behind, were beginning to move from the lower fields, where they'd wintered, to the higher ground without much prompting, following some internal calendar of their own. Clara had stopped counting the days since her arrival. She had begun somewhere in the second week to stop measuring her time here against her time in Boston and to simply live in the days themselves. She noticed when she did this. It struck her as significant, though she couldn't have explained why to anyone who asked. She sent a letter to her school explaining that she would be away longer than expected. Her supervisor, a woman named Mrs. Hatch, who had spent 30 years in Boston classrooms and respected practical necessity above all things, wrote back to say she would hold Clara's position through the end of the school year, and they would discuss it in September. It was a letter both gracious and measured, like Mrs. Hatch herself, who had never been extravagant with anything she could not afford to give, and who had learned over a long career to recognize when a good person needed room to make a decision. Clara read it twice and set it in the writing desk beside James's journal. She was aware that she was making a choice without quite making it, that the act of not yet returning was itself a kind of answer, and she did not push the thought further than that. She was discovering more patient with herself than she used to be. Another thing Montana had given her or drawn out of her. She couldn't yet tell the difference. Noah had begun teaching her to manage the cattle directly, how to read the animals' intentions before they acted, how to move around a small group to steer their direction without causing alarm, how to use the horse and dog as extensions of her will rather than implements she simply sat on or walked beside. This was harder than fence work because it required a kind of peripheral attention she had not developed, and because the cattle had no interest in her learning process. The border collie Ames was the most efficient creature she had encountered. He worked with a focused intelligence that made her wonder about the interior life of dogs, the speed with which he translated a situation into action, the way he seemed to anticipate where animals were going, rather than simply responding to where they had gone. She asked Noah about this. "He reads the herd," Noah said. They were watching Ames work the far end of the lower pasture, the dog holding a group of 4 cattle steady, while Noah and Clara repositioned. "He's been doing it since he was 8 months old. He's better at it than I am." "But you trained him." "I gave him the direction. He developed the skill." He paused, watching the dog make a small adjustment, 3 quick steps that shifted a steer by exactly the angle needed. Some things can't be taught, only practiced until they're native. She thought about that for the rest of the morning. The cattle needed moving to the upper pasture by late May, which required both of them on horseback for a full day. The drive took most of it. It was slow, deliberate work, less dramatic than she had expected from stories she had read about cattle drives, less chaos, more the careful steering of water than anything violent. Animals moved when given a reason to move, resisted when not. Ames worked the flanks and the rear. Noah worked the lead animals. Clara on patch held the right side. She made mistakes twice, once when she came in too fast and scattered a small group toward a fence line, once when she misjudged a steer's intention and let him double back, and each time Noah corrected for her without comment, absorbing her error into his own movement as if they had simply renegotiated the plan. By late afternoon, the herd was in the upper pasture and the gate was secured, and they were both dusty and tired in the good used way of honest work. They stopped at the top of the ridge to let the horses breathe, and from that height the whole of the ranch spread out below them, the house, the barn, the creek winding through the bottomland, the dark timber at the base of the mountains to the north, and beyond the timber, the snowfields still white and permanent looking on the high peaks. The light was going amber and long, the way it did in the late afternoon here, making everything look simultaneously real and impossible. Clara looked at it for a long time. "I keep thinking," she said, "that I should want to go home, and then I wonder what I mean by home." Noah said nothing for a moment. He was looking at the same view, but she had the sense he was watching something she couldn't quite see, some layer of the land that was only visible to people who had been in it long enough. "Home is usually the place where you know the work," he said finally. "I didn't know this work 3 weeks ago." "No," he said. He looked at her, then directly in the way he looked at her when he was saying something he meant. "You do now." She sat with that on the way back down, the horses picking their careful way along the ridge trail, Ames trotting ahead with his efficient collie energy, occasionally glancing back to confirm they were all still in the right order. She told Noah about the journal that evening. They were at the kitchen table and she set it in front of him without prelude and said, "James left this in the writing desk, October 1890. He looked at it for a long moment without touching it. She could see him deciding something. "I know you've read it," she said. "I'm not asking you to read it again. She stopped. "He wrote about you. He asked me to thank you if I ever got the chance." She paused. "So, thank you." Noah's jaw tightened. A muscle moved at his temple. He looked at the journal and then at the table, and then at a point somewhere past her shoulder. "He didn't need to thank me," he said. "He did," she said. "That's the kind of man he was." A silence. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind moved through the aspen along the creek bank with that particular papery sound that was the sound of 1,000 small leaves turning on their stems. "The river crossing," Noah said at last. "I went in after him because I didn't think about it. I wasn't being brave, I was just there and he was in the water and I went in." He paused. "Afterward, I was shaking for an hour. Adrenaline mostly. The cold." He shook his head slightly. He seemed to think it meant something large about me. "I thought it was just what you do when someone needs pulling out of a river." "Some people don't," she said. He absorbed that. "He was a good man," Noah said. "In the few weeks I knew him, he was careful with things. He noticed things." He looked at the journal again, something in his expression she couldn't quite name, something between sorrow and gratitude, and the particular weight of a loss that happened at a remove to someone else, but still managed to take something from you. He talked about you every day near about, what you were doing back in Boston, what you'd probably think of Montana. He described you. He stopped and something shifted in his face. He described you with great care, like getting it right mattered. "What did he say?" she said. She needed to ask. She needed to hear it. Noah looked at the wall for a moment. "He said you were the most honest person he'd ever known," he said. "That you couldn't be talked into seeing things wrong once you'd seen them right. That you were fierce about things you cared about and patient about things you didn't, which he said was a rare combination and one he had never fully deserved." Clara pressed her lips together. "He was wrong about that last part," she said after a moment. "He deserved much better than he thought." "Maybe," Noah said. "Either way, he knew you." "And what would I think," she said, "of Montana?" For the first time in her presence, something that was nearly a smile moved across his face. It was brief and cautious and completely genuine. "He said you'd complain about the distance and then refuse to leave," Noah said. Clara sat very still for a moment. Then she laughed, a real one, full and unself-conscious, and pressed her hand over her mouth because it was so exactly right that it was almost unbearable. It was so precisely James knowing her well enough to predict her exactly putting it into words he'd shared with a stranger, because he couldn't quite say it to her face. "He knew me," she said when the laughter had settled. "He did," Noah said. The almost smile was gone, replaced by something quieter and harder to read. "He knew you very well." They sat for a while in the kitchen. She poured more coffee and he accepted it. The evening pressed against the windows, full and dark and full of stars. "Noah," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. He looked at her. "Why are you still here?" she said. "Not as a criticism. I mean, you've been here 4 years. You could have moved on after Harlan died. You had no obligation." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. It was a thing she had noticed he did when he was thinking about something he usually left unthought. "I had a rough few years before I came here," he said eventually. "Before Harlan, I was—" He stopped, started again. "I made some choices I'm not proud of. I was not a good man for a while." She waited. "I did things that were wrong," he said. He said it flatly with no ornamentation and no self-pity, which told her more than embellishment would have. "Nothing that hurt anyone but myself and a few people who trusted me, which is its own kind of hurt. But wrong. I knew it and did it anyway, which is worse than not knowing." She waited. "Harlan hired me when no one else would," he said. "He didn't ask questions. He just gave me work and let me be useful, which is the only thing I was sure I could still be." He paused. "And then your husband came through and went in the river and I pulled him out, and afterward he sat by the fire and told me I was a decent man and seemed to think this was obvious. Like he couldn't understand why I'd need telling." He turned the cup again. "I hadn't been called a decent man in some time." "So you stayed," she said. "I stayed," he said. "I made promises. I take those seriously." He paused. I thought that if I kept my promises long enough, the man James saw would be the man I actually was. That you can build yourself back out of the right actions if you do enough of them." "And," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know yet," he said with an honesty so complete she felt it like a change in the air. "I know I'm better than I was. I know the ranch is better. I know the cattle are in good shape, and the land is in good shape, and the fences are as good as I can make them." He looked at the cup. "Whether that makes me the man James thought I was, I can't answer that." "I think," Clara said carefully, That a man who asks that question rather than assuming the answer is probably closer than he knows. He looked at her. She held his gaze. That, he said finally, is a teacher talking. A teacher and a woman who has read your work, she said, both of which I am. He nodded slowly, turned his cup one more time. But eventually the promises would be fulfilled, she said gently. Eventually I'd sell or not sell or go home, and the promises would be done. What happens then? He looked at her for a long moment. The lamplight put shadows in the angles of his face, made him look older and younger simultaneously. I don't know, he said. I haven't thought past now. That seems like something worth thinking about, she said. He stood, picked up his cup, rinsed it carefully. Good night, Clara. Good night, Noah, she said. She listened to him cross the yard to the barn, and she sat for a while with both cups clean and drying by the basin and the lamp burning low, and she thought about a man who had stopped imagining his own future and what it would take to convince him to start again. The fire came at the end of May from the north. Clara smelled it before she saw it, a sharpness in the air, different from the clean smell of the ranch's wood-burning stoves, different from the controlled burning of brush that the Halverson family had been doing on their place to the east. This was heavier with a char underneath it, and it came on a shift in the wind that was itself wrong for the time of day. She was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when the wind changed and the smell hit her, and she turned toward the mountains and saw the brown haze above the tree line. Not smoke exactly, not yet, but the presence of smoke the way a coming storm announces itself in the color of the sky before the clouds arrive. She ran to the barn. Noah was already coming out of it, moving fast, his face tight with something that was not panic, but its near neighbor, a controlled urgency that she had not seen in him before, which told her how serious this was. Timber fire, he said. Winds pushing it south. It could come down the ridge into the upper pasture. The cattle, she said. We need to get them out of the upper pasture and into the lower fields before the fire crests. If it crowns in that timber, it'll come down fast, nothing to stop it. Tell me what to do. He did. The next 3 hours were the hardest work she had ever done. They rode hard to the upper pasture, she and Noah and Ames, and the smoke was thicker than she had expected by the time they reached the ridge gate, a dirty yellowish gray that stung her eyes and put a taste like ash on her lips. Patch was nervous in a way she had not experienced, a constant fine trembling in his skin, his ears working rapidly back and forth, his footfalls high and careful in the way of a horse that doesn't trust the ground. She talked to him continuously, her voice as even as she could keep it, which required an active effort because she could see the fire, now a red-orange line in the timber above the ridge moving fast. She kept talking. She told him she needed him. She told him he was steady and brave, and that she would not ask more of him than he could give. She didn't know if any of this registered, but his ears settled slightly and he kept moving. The cattle were already nervous. They smelled the smoke and were beginning to bunch at the far end of the pasture, which was the wrong direction toward the ridge away from the gate. Noah and Ames went around the left flank. She and Patch went right, pushing them away from the fence and toward the center of the pasture, driving them in an arc that would bring them back through the gate. She came in closer and faster than she had in any practice drive because there was no time for practice drive caution. When animals tried to scatter the wrong way, she pushed back hard, Patch responding to her urgency with more fire in his step than she'd felt from him before, both of them working from the same impulse. She made mistakes. She knew she was making them in real time, reading an animal wrong, coming in at the wrong angle, losing a small group around the left, and having to push Patch in a hard circle to recover them. She didn't stop. She corrected and kept moving. The cattle moved, slowly at first, the lead animal suspicious, then faster as the smoke thickened, and the fire sounds a low roar she hadn't heard until now. Not wind, something more purposeful came down from the ridge. And then in a trot that was nearly a run, they came through the lower gate, and she swung it shut behind the last one, and leaned on the post and could not speak for a full minute. Noah came up beside her on his sorrel roan, and he was breathing hard too, and there was a streak of ash on his jaw. Fence is gonna hold, he said, looking toward the fire line on the ridge. The smoke was heavy up there, but the fire hadn't crested yet. The wind, still pushing south, was also pushing the fire east along the contour of the ridge, which might be what saved them. If the wind stays south, it'll push it east and miss the pasture land. They watched. An hour passed. The fire tracked east. The smoke went with it, the sky above them gradually lightening from yellow-brown to the clean high blue of a May afternoon. The cattle settled in the lower pasture, the worst of their fear gone, moving in the slow, purposeful pattern of animals that have been frightened and are now hungry. When it was clear they were safe, Clara got off patch and sat down in the grass. Not because she was hurt, because she was tired in a way that went all the way to the bottom of her, and her hands were shaking now that the urgency was gone, and she needed to be on the ground for a moment and admit that to herself. Noah dismounted beside her and sat on a fence rail and said nothing at all, which was exactly right. "I thought I was going to lose him," she said, meaning Patch. "You didn't. I was terrified the entire time." "So was I," he said. "That's what the fear's for. It makes you quick." She looked at him. His face was dirty with smoke, and he was as tired as she was, and he was sitting on the fence rail in the gray late afternoon light, looking at the cattle in the lower pasture, with the expression of a man who has seen something he cares about survive and is feeling the weight of that. "Noah," she said. He looked at her. She did not plan what she said next. She was too tired for planning. "I think I love this place," she said. "I didn't expect to, but I do." Something shifted in his face. Not surprise exactly, but a change in the pressure of things, a small seismic event in the careful terrain of his expression. "I know," he said. She had the distinct sense that he was not speaking only about the place. They sat in the grass and on the fence rail in the fading afternoon, while the smoke drifted east and the cattle settled, and Ames put his chin on Clara's knee and looked up at her with his copper-colored eyes steady and satisfied. She told him that night, not all of it, not yet, but enough. They were at the kitchen table again. That table had become the center of things between them, the place where they sat across from each other with coffee or after dinner and talked in the way they had gradually learned to talk, which was honestly and without pretense. She had come to think of it as the one room in the ranch house that she had fully claimed. Not the bedroom, which still felt like a guest room. Not the parlor with Harlan's writing desk and papers. The kitchen where things got done and coffee got made, and the lamp between them threw the same light every evening. She said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to just hear it without whatever you would normally do with things like this." He looked at her steadily. "All right. I'm not going to sell," she said. "I've decided." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the night was still with the particular stillness that follows a crisis, the world settling back into itself, reclaiming its ordinary weight. "What about Boston?" he said. "Boston will go on without me," she said. "It always does." She paused. "I want to open a school. Here on the ranch at least, to start there, our children out on these roads with nowhere to go. I've spoken with the Alderman family and the Crockers and 2 or 3 others. There are 12 children within reasonable riding distance." "A school," he said. "A small one." She looked at him. "I'd need help with the building." He was quiet for a long moment. She watched him. He was thinking, which for Noah was a visible process, not agitation, but a kind of deliberate stillness. "I can build," he said. "I know," she said. "You can build most things." She paused. "Noah, I also need to know, if I stay, what are you going to do? Because if you're staying because of a promise you made to a man 3 years dead, that's not enough of a reason. I won't have someone here out of obligation." The lamp between them put a warm circle of light on the table. Outside, the wind had died with the sunset and the night was very still, and the creek was the loudest thing in it. "Clara," he said, and her name in his voice had a quality it had not had before, something careful and deliberate. "I have been here out of obligation, that's true. But," he stopped, looked at his hands. "I am not a man who knows how to say things like this." "Say them anyway," she said. He looked at her. "If you stay," he said, "it stops being about obligation somewhere around the second day you were here. I don't know what to do with that. I have not," he breathed. "It has been a long time since I wanted anything for myself that I was willing to admit to wanting." She held very still. "But," he said, "if you stay, I would like to stay too. Not because of James or Harlan or any promise. Because—" Another stop. He breathed again, and she could see what it cost him, and she did not look away. "Because you hold a fence post, right, even when it's heavy. Because you stayed up half the night with a horse you didn't have to. Because you laughed in my barn, and I didn't know I was waiting for that until it happened." He paused. "And because I would like the chance to see what that becomes if you'll allow it." The kitchen was very quiet. Clara looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. He nodded once, the way he had nodded at the fence line in that first week, the way he acknowledged something that had been said and meant and understood by both parties. "All right," he said. She got up and put the coffee cups away, and they said good night, the way they always did, and he went out to the barn and she went upstairs. Nothing outwardly had changed, and everything had. In the morning when she came downstairs, the coffee was already made, and beside it was a piece of paper with a rough sketch of a small building. One room, south-facing windows drawn carefully in with their proper dimensions, marked a porch along the front. Beside it, in his spare handwriting, "Good light all morning." She stood in the kitchen in her stocking feet holding it. She put it in the writing desk with the journal and the letter from Margaret and all the other things she was keeping. June came, and with it, the real Montana summer, warm and clean and vast. The sky, that particular shade of blue that Clara had decided existed nowhere else in the world, or at least nowhere she had been, and she was willing to be wrong about this, but doubted she would be. The grassland in the upper pasture stood knee-high and moving in every wind, a constant conversation between air and grass that she had come to find deeply comforting. The way you find comforting any sound that suggests the world is going on properly about its business. The cattle were fat and content. The filly had recovered completely from her night of colic and had accepted the saddle with a kind of resigned pragmatism that Clara considered a milestone. The creek ran full and cold from the snowmelt still happening somewhere up in the high country. She had decided staying. She wrote to Mrs. Hatch. She wrote to the bank in Boston about arranging transfer of her accounts westward, which was the most decisive single thing she had done since signing the deed transfer with Crane, and which felt, after she sent the letter, like putting down something heavy she had been carrying without recognizing it as a burden. She wrote to her friend Margaret, who had been her closest companion in the years after James's death, who wrote back so quickly that Clara laughed, "I suspected you would not come back quickly. Boston is very much the same as you left it, which I suspect is one of the reasons you haven't." There was more practical warmth entirely. Margaret, and the letter ended, "I want to hear about the Cowboys, plural." She pinned this to the wall above the writing desk. Noah had begun clearing the ground for the school building on the flat stretch between the ranch house and the road. He worked on it in the mornings before the ranch's other demands came calling, and she would come down to find the site a little further along each day. Stakes-driven, grade-leveled materials organized in the careful way of a man who planned further ahead than he ever announced. She helped when she could, which was more often than not. She had learned enough by now to be useful at most tasks. She had not kissed him again. He had not pushed toward it. They had not spoken directly about what he had said in the kitchen that night, and she had the distinct sense that he would not be the one to reach across the distance between them. He had said his piece at considerable cost, with genuine difficulty, and he was now waiting the way he always waited, with the particular patience of a man who had learned not to assume good things were owed to him. She found this alternately admirable and quietly maddening. She was not ready entirely. She knew this about herself, and she was honest with herself about it. There was something she was still working out. Some accounting she hadn't finished. She did not think it had to do with James exactly. She thought it had to do with trust, with knowing who a person was before you opened things that could not be easily reclosed. She was a careful woman. She always had been. It was the water. She noticed it first on a Monday morning in the first week of June when she went down to the creek bank to check on the dam they had repaired in April. She did this regularly now. The water level in the holding pond above the dam was something she monitored the way she might monitor a student's progress, with systematic attention and the note of any change. The level was visibly lower than it had been the week before. Not dramatically, perhaps 4 inches in the pond, perhaps less in the creek flow itself, but measurably. She stood on the bank and looked at it for a moment, then went back up to the ranch house. She mentioned it to Noah at breakfast. He set his coffee cup down slowly. Not dramatically, just with a deliberateness that told her the information had connected to something. "How much lower?" he said. "Several inches in the pond. The flow coming in from upstream seems thinner." He stood up from the table without finishing his meal and went out. She followed him to the creek. He spent 20 minutes upstream, moving quickly and with focus, crossing to both banks at points where the current was shallow, reading the water with the particular knowledge of a man who had spent 4 years learning every inch of this creek. She stayed at the bend below the dam and watched him. When he came back, he had something on his face that she had not seen before. Not anger exactly, something colder and more precise. "There's a diversion," he said. "Someone built a cut above the upper ford, channeling water off to the east. It's recent, a week at most, maybe less." Someone diverted the water from our creek, she said. Diverted water from your property, he said. Which means, he stopped. Which means the cattle will start struggling by midsummer, she said. And any farming I tried would fail, and I'd be forced to sell if I couldn't sustain the ranch. He looked at her. Neither of them said the name. She was thinking clearly the way she thought clearly in a classroom when a problem presented itself unexpectedly and the children were watching for her to panic. She didn't panic. She assessed. Can we prove it? She said. I need to follow the diversion channel and see where it goes, he said. I'll come. He looked at her for a moment, that brief assessment she was so familiar with by now. Come then, he said. They followed the cut channel east along the ridge for nearly 3 miles through timber and across 2 fence lines that Clara noted were not on the property maps she had been studying. The channel was not subtle. It was a serious earthwork, not the kind of thing done hastily, which meant it had been planned. She followed it, and she thought about planning. The reservoir at the end of the channel was new, the raw earth of the banks still dark with moisture and not yet weathered. It sat on the edge of what she recognized from the county map as Benjamin Reed's South property. She stood at the edge of the earthwork and looked at it for a long time. A magpie landed on the near bank, regarded her with one bright eye, and departed. He wanted to dry us out, she said. Looks like, Noah said. He was crouched at the edge of the channel looking at the workmanship. This is professional. He hired it done, didn't dig it himself. He stood. He knew you might not sell if things were going well, so he gave you a reason. She did not feel anger exactly. She felt something colder and more precise, the same thing she felt when a student presented her with a forged excuse, or when she caught a deliberate cheating on an examination. A kind of clarity, a clear view of exactly what had happened and the specific nature of the insult. He had not miscalculated. He had calculated very well. He had been charming and generous and interesting, and simultaneously he had been arranging a pressure that would increase until she had no reasonable alternative. I need to talk to Mr. Crane, she said. Clara, Noah said it carefully. I can go to Reed directly. No, she said. She looked at him. I need to talk to Mr. Crane, and then I need to talk to Benjamin Reed myself. He held her gaze for a moment. She could see the restraint it took. All right, he said. Ellsworth Crane came to the ranch 2 days later at Clara's request, and she walked him out to the diversion site and showed him everything: the channel, the earthworks, the reservoir, the fence lines that crossed where they shouldn't. He looked at everything carefully in the manner of a man who had been a lawyer in this county for 30 years and had learned not to arrive at conclusions before he had walked the ground and had the ground confirm what he thought. He was quiet on the way back. He picked up a rock near the channel entry point and turned it in his hands and put it down. The water rights in the original deed are clear, he said, walking back through the timber. Copper Creek runs from the headwaters through the northeast corner of your property before it crosses onto Reed's land. He has rights to the downstream flow, not to the source, not to anything on your side of the property line. So what he's done is illegal, she said. It's a trespass and a water rights violation at minimum, Crane said. In this territory, water rights are serious matters. People have lost ranches over disputes less clear than this one. He was quiet for a moment. He'll dispute it if pressed. He has resources for a dispute, but the documentation is solidly on your side. He looked at her. I should tell you, in 30 years, I've seen Benjamin Reed do hard things in business. He's not a man who hesitates when he sees what he wants. But I have not seen him do something this direct, this calculated. He thought I'd sell before anyone noticed, she said. Or he thought no one would trace it. You have a sharp eye, Crane said. I have a teacher's eye, she said, for discrepancies. She paused, and I was paying attention. That evening she drove herself into Copper Falls. She had gotten comfortable enough with the buckboard to manage it alone, and she wanted the drive. She needed the time with the horse and the road and the sound of the wheels to think clearly before she walked into that house. She did not send word ahead. She arrived unannounced. The hired hand at the gate of the Broken Spur gave her a look that suggested this was unusual, and that he was uncertain whether it was allowed, and she looked at him pleasantly and waited until he opened the gate. Benjamin Reed received her in his parlor. He was whatever else, he was a man who maintained composure, and his composure held when she came through his door unannounced, though she saw something flicker behind his eyes that he shut down quickly. He poured 2 glasses of brandy without being asked and set one in front of her. She did not touch it. "Tell me about the diversion," she said. A pause. Brief. He was good at pauses, at taking the space he needed to position himself correctly. "Clara." "Don't," she said. Her voice was completely even. "Don't say my name and then redirect the conversation. Tell me what you did and why." He sat back in his chair. Something went out of him, some professional ease, some performance. Beneath it, she could see for the first time the actual man, tired and calculating and cornered and not entirely comfortable with being any of those things. "I needed that water," he said. "My southern grazing is drying up. I've been losing head every year. The drought last summer I've been compensating with supplemental feed, but that can't go on. I needed the water rights." "So you had my creek diverted?" "I had a channel cut," he said. "No one was hurt." "No one was hurt." She repeated it, not mockingly, just clearly. "My cattle would have been drinking dry creek beds by August. My school would have had no water for its well. My land would have failed and I would have been forced to sell, at which point you would have purchased it generously and the problem would have solved itself. Is that about right?" He looked at her directly. "Yes." "And you thought—" "I thought it was business." He said it without apology, but she could see it cost him something. Some image he had been presenting to himself. Some story he had been telling about the kind of man he was. "I thought you would see a failing enterprise and take my offer and go back to Boston better off than you came. I didn't intend to harm you." "You intended to leave me no choice," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I also—" He stopped. He looked at his hands, which were clasped on the table with a tension she had not seen in him before, all the easy authority gone from them. "Clara, I meant what I said at dinner. Every word of it." He looked at her. I believed that if you sold the Whitmore land and were free of that particular burden, you might—" He stopped again. She understood what he was not saying. "You thought I might choose you," she said. She said it without cruelty, but without softening it either. She owed him that much precision. "Yes," he said. She sat with that. It was, she thought, almost a sadder thing than simple villainy. He had done a bad thing for bad reasons, and also for a reason that contained at its bottom something genuine. He had wanted her. He had wanted the land. And he had not apparently seen clearly enough to understand that the way you go about wanting a thing reveals the truth of you regardless of what the thing is. "It doesn't matter what you meant," she said. "You deceived me. You tried to take away the thing I care about through manipulation rather than persuasion. That's not—" She paused, choosing words carefully. "That's not a man I can be in any kind of relationship with, business or otherwise." He looked at her. His jaw was tight. "I've spoken with Mr. Crane," she said. "He believes the water rights violation is clear in law. I'm asking you to restore the creek to its natural course within 2 weeks. If you do, and you compensate Crane for the time I've spent addressing this, I won't pursue legal action." She paused. "If you don't, I'll file with the county and the federal land office, and I'll win because I'm right, and the documentation is clear. And winning this particular case matters to me in ways that exceed the inconvenience of the time." He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him calculating, measuring her, trying to find the angle she had left open. There was none. "2 weeks," he said at last. "2 weeks," she said. She stood. "Clara." He stood too. "I am—" He stopped, looked at some point past her shoulder. "I am sorry, that's not sufficient, but I am." She looked at him. She believed him. That was the complicated part. The apology was genuine, and it changed nothing, and both of these things were true simultaneously. "I know," she said. "Good night, Mr. Reed." She left him standing in his beautiful parlor with the 2 untouched glasses of brandy and the chandelier burning overhead, lighting up the room that expressed exactly who he wanted to be. She did not go back to the ranch immediately. She drove the buckboard to the edge of town and stopped the mare at a wide spot in the road that overlooked a bend in Copper Creek. The creek was visible from here, a distant silver line in the early dark. She sat and looked at it. She had been betrayed. She understood that clearly. She also understood, and this was the part that surprised her, that she was not devastated by it. She was angry, a clean, cold anger that she would probably feel for several days, a steady burn rather than a consuming one, but she was not wounded in the bone-deep way she had feared certain disappointments might wound her. Because Benjamin Reed had never had her whole trust. She had liked him. She had been charmed by him. She had found him genuinely interesting, and she had not been wrong about that. He was interesting, capable, complicated. But she had never given him the unreserved belief she gave to things she truly valued. She had always some part of her kept the lamp turned in a different direction. She knew where the lamp was pointed. She sat for another few minutes in the cooling evening air, letting the anger settle from hot to cold, where it was more useful, and then she picked up the reins and turned the mare toward home. Noah was on the porch when she got back. He was sitting in the dark with a cup of coffee cooling beside him, which was a thing she had seen him do before he seemed to find the night air clarifying or perhaps simply necessary. He stood when she turned the buckboard into the yard and came to help with the mare without being asked. She unhitched the harness and he hung it while she settled the mare in the corral with water and hay. And they did all of this with the comfortable efficiency of two people who had worked together long enough to know each other's movements. "Crane told me you'd gone to Reed," he said finally. "I went to Reed," she confirmed. He said nothing. He waited. "He admitted it," she said. "He's going to restore the creek." A silence. "Are you all right?" he said. She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes," she said. "I'm angry, but I'm all right." He was quiet for a moment. They were standing in the corral with the mare drowsing between them, the stars overhead in their usual extravagant excess, the night very still. "You shouldn't have had to do that alone," he said. "I should have, Noah," she said. He stopped. "It was my conversation to have," she said. "It was my land and my decision and my confrontation. I don't need protecting from things I can handle myself." He looked at her. In the pale starlight, she could see the effort it took him to accept that, not because he doubted her capabilities, she could see clearly that he did not, but because the instinct to protect was bone deep in him, and had been for a long time, and managing it was a discipline rather than an easy achievement. "I know," he said. "I know that." "Good," she said. They stood for a moment more. "Clara," he said. "Yes," she said. "I am—" He paused. He said it plainly without drama, which made it more effective than drama would have been. "There is something I need to say. I have been waiting. Because you asked me to let you lead and because I don't want to—" Another stop. "I am afraid of wanting something I don't have the right to want." She stepped around the mare and stood in front of him. He was tall enough that she had to look up slightly, and he was looking at her with those dark, careful eyes that had been reading her since the first day. With a patience she had only slowly come to understand was not indifference but its opposite. "You have the right," she said, "if you want to claim it." He put one hand on the fence rail behind her, not touching her, just steadying himself, the way you steady yourself when something you've been waiting for arrives. "Clara," he said. "Yes, Noah," she said. He bent his head and kissed her briefly and carefully, the way he did most things with full attention and no waste. It was the kind of kiss that is itself a promise rather than a beginning, and she stood very still and felt something come finally to rest in her, like the last piece of something settling into place. When he pulled back, he looked at her with an expression she had not seen on anyone's face in a very long time, as if she were the answer to a question he had been afraid to formulate. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. He stepped back and picked up the mare's lead rope and walked her toward the barn. Unhurried, and Clara stood in the corral alone under the enormous Montana sky and felt for the first time since James had died like she was standing in the right place at the right time, with the right future ahead of her. 3 days later, Noah confronted Benjamin Reed. Not at Clara's request, she had not asked for it and would not have. But Noah had his own accounting to do, his own side of this, and she understood without him telling her that he needed to say certain things face to face with the man who had tried to manipulate her out of her own land. She found out about it afterward from the county clerk who had witnessed it at the feed store. Apparently, Noah had walked in on Benjamin Reed in the middle of a conversation about grain prices and had waited until the conversation finished. This detail, the waiting, was so characteristically Noah that she felt a wave of affection that she didn't quite know what to do with, and then had said what needed saying, quietly and directly, without theatrics. He had told Reed that the diversion had been a cowardly act against a woman who had done nothing but try to understand what she'd inherited, that the creek had better be restored before the deadline, that this was not a negotiable point, and that whatever Reed thought he was owed in this county, in this territory, in this particular stretch of creek bottom, He was owed nothing on the Whitmore land. Reed had responded. The clerk hadn't caught all of it, but the tone had not been friendly. Noah had answered one sentence the clerk said quietly enough that he'd missed it and walked out. She asked Noah about it that evening on the porch. "You confronted him," she said. "I said what I had to say," Noah said. "I told you I could handle it myself." "You did," he said. "And you did. This was different." He paused. He was watching the last light on the ridge, that thin line of gold before the dark came fully down. "You said your piece. I had mine." She thought about that. She understood the distinction. He had not been protecting her. He had been standing up for something in himself, some line he had needed to draw, some answer he owed to his own idea of what was right. "What did you say to him at the end?" she asked. The one sentence the clerk couldn't hear. He was quiet for a moment, his eyes still on the ridge. "I told him the land was worth more than he'd ever offered her," he said. "Any of it." She looked at him. He was watching the ridge, his face in profile, the last sunlight making a clean line along his jaw. She reached over and put her hand over his where it rested on his knee. He turned his hand under hers and held it, steady and quiet. They sat on the porch in the evening, and below the ridge the creek ran full and clear, restored to its natural course, and speaking, as it always did, in its low, persistent voice. The cattle were in the lower pasture. The sky was going deep blue above the mountains. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark was having the last word of the day. She did not need anything else. She was home. The school opened on the 14th of September. It was a Monday, which seemed appropriate. Schools ought to begin on Mondays on the grounds that some things deserved to be made official. The building was not large, one room as Noah had sketched it in those small hours, after the night she told him she was staying with south-facing windows that let in so much morning light. The room seemed to expand when the sun came around. There was a wood stove in the corner and 12 desks built from lodgepole pine by Noah and the Crocker boys, who were among the students and had contributed to their own furniture with considerable pride of workmanship. There was a blackboard that Ellsworth Crane had arranged to have freighted from Billings, which had arrived in late July and which Clara had chalked with her name and the date before any student had set foot in the building, just to see how it looked. It had looked like a school. 12 children came on that first Monday. They ranged from 6 to 14 from families spread across a 5-mile radius: the Crockers, the Aldermans, the Halverson family. From up on the north bench, 2 children of a widow named Margaret Trent, who ran a small dairy operation with competence and minimal assistance. They arrived on horseback or in family wagons or in 2 cases on foot, and they stood in the yard with the particular combination of wariness and curiosity that children bring to new things. Clara stood on the porch of the school and looked at them. "Come in," she said. "We have work to do." She taught in the mornings and ran the ranch in the afternoons. It was hard. She did not pretend otherwise to Noah or to Mr. Crane or to Margaret Trent, who became over the course of the fall something near a friend, a woman who had built a working life in this territory by the sheer refusal to imagine alternatives. Clara was tired most evenings in a way that went to the marrow. There were weeks when the cattle and the schoolwork and the administrative demands of the property combined into something that felt genuinely overwhelming, and she handled these by making a list at the kitchen table and addressing items in order of urgency, which was what she had always done with problems that tried to present themselves as catastrophes. She had come to understand a more capable woman than she had ever needed to be in Boston. This was not a pleasant discovery so much as a useful one. She filed it under things to tell Margaret in her next letter. Noah was there for the hard parts, not managing them for her. She had made clear once what she needed and did not need, and he had heard it and adjusted without grievance. But present, working beside her when there was work to share, giving her the kind of help that was about adding capacity rather than taking over. He also, she had discovered, had a gift with the children. He had not volunteered this. She had simply noticed one afternoon when school let out and 3 of the Crocker boys lingered near the fence where he was working, that he talked to them without condescension or performance, gave them things to hold, explained what he was doing, answered their questions with the same patient directness he gave to everything. Thomas Crocker, who was 11 and had arrived on the first day with the hard-eyed suspicion of a child who had learned adults were not reliable, had attached himself to Noah with the particular intensity of a boy who has found someone he believes in. "He follows you like Ames follows me," she told Noah one evening. "He works hard," Noah said. "He just needs someone to notice." "You sound like a teacher." He looked at her sidelong as if this were a preposterous suggestion. "I sound like a person," he said. She smiled at the table. The diversion had been restored by mid-June, as Reed had promised. Crane had confirmed the water rights in writing, and Clara had filed copies with the county land office and the territorial government in Helena, so there would be no ambiguity going forward. Reed had paid Crane's time and said nothing further, and Clara had said nothing further either, and that particular chapter was closed. She saw Benjamin Reed once more before autumn. It was in town at the dry goods store, and he was coming out as she was going in, and they stopped in the doorway for a brief moment. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Reed," she said. He held the door. She went in. That was all. She found afterward that she felt nothing much about him. Not anger, not residual warmth, not pity. Just a clear, quiet assessment, the way you might regard a mathematical problem that has been solved. It was interesting once, and now it is done. The first frost came in October. She had been warned about Montana winters by Crane and by Margaret Trent, and by a number of other people who seemed to take genuine satisfaction in the preparation of an outsider for the specific challenges of their climate. She had purchased what was necessary heavier clothing than she owned additional firewood laid in against the barn wall in cords that Noah split, and she stacked a supply of feed for the cattle through the winter months. She had winterized the school building with the students' help, which had become a full day's project that involved caulking and banked earth around the foundation and a great deal of discussion about the proper depth of insulation. She was not afraid of winter. She admitted to herself, a little apprehensive about the kind of cold she had not yet experienced. There was a difference. The first freeze came on a Wednesday night in early October. Not dramatically, the temperature simply dropped below zero by morning and stayed there. And she came downstairs to find ice in the water basin and frost on the inside of the kitchen windows, and Noah already at the woodpile, splitting with the unhurried efficiency she had spent 6 months watching and still found extraordinary. She put on 3 layers and her heaviest coat and went out with the coffee. He took it, and they stood in the cold yard, their breath making small clouds, the frost on the grass catching the early light like scattered glass. "How bad does it get?" she said. "Worse than this," he said. "How much worse?" he considered. "Weeks below zero, snow to the windowsills, wind that'll cut through anything less than wool." He drank his coffee. "You'll manage. You're stubborn enough." Is that a compliment? In Montana, he said, yes. She stood beside him in the cold, holding her own coffee cup with both hands, and she thought about the woman who had stepped off a train in April with 2 trunks and a legal letter and no idea what she was walking into. She thought about that woman with a kind of fond exasperation, the way you feel about your former self when you have become something more. She had not become more. She had become more herself. That was different, and it was better. On a Sunday in November, she told Noah about James. The real telling, not the facts of the journal, which he already knew, but the texture of the grief, the specific shape it had taken in the 3 years between James's death and the letter from Montana. She told him about the first winter, how she had gone through the motions of teaching and cooking and being alive with such deliberateness that people had commented on her composure without understanding that the composure was the only thing holding her upright. She told him about the anniversary of James's death, which she had spent in her classroom alone at 6 in the morning, chalking grammar exercises on the board because she could not be in the apartment. She told him that she had not expected to want anything again, not because she was broken, but because she had not believed there was room, that grief had taken up the space where desire lives and had simply claimed it. Noah listened to all of it. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, and he listened with his full attention, which was a different quality of attention from most people's. He did not fill the silences with comfort or redirect with stories of his own. He simply received what she was saying, and when she stopped, he sat with it for a moment. "Do you miss him?" he said. She considered the question honestly. "Yes," she said. "I will always miss him. He was a good man, and he was mine, and I loved him." She paused. "But I don't think loving you and missing him have to occupy the same space. I think I was wrong about that for a long time." Noah looked at her. In the months since that first kiss in the corral, they had found their way to each other with the same care they brought to everything, slowly, attentively, without rushing. He had not pushed. She had not retreated. They had learned each other the way you learn new country, one landmark at a time, drawing your own maps. "You said you loved me," he said. He said it quietly with the precise attention he gave to things that mattered. "I did say that," she agreed. A silence. He turned his coffee cup. "Good," he said. He looked up at her. "I love you too. I have since I don't know exactly since when. Sometime in May, you were arguing with the stove." "The stove deserved to be argued with," she said. "It did," he said. "You won." She looked at him across the table. Outside, the November wind was moving through the aspens, stripping the last of the leaves, making that particular sound that was neither sad nor happy, but simply truthful about the season. Inside, the stove was burning steadily. The coffee was hot. Through the kitchen window, she could see the barn, and beyond the barn, the ridge, and above the ridge, the enormous Montana sky. "Noah," she said. "Clara," he said. "Marry me," she said. A long pause. He looked at her with an expression she had learned over the months to read with some confidence, though she still sometimes missed layers of it. What she saw was surprise, genuine, unguarded, and then something else, something that went down through the surprise like water through rock, steady and warm. "I was going to ask you," he said. "Were you?" "Eventually," he said. "I was building up to it." "How long would that have taken?" He thought about this seriously, which she appreciated. "A while," he admitted. "Then I saved us both some time," she said. He looked at her for a long moment more, and then he nodded once, the way he had nodded at the fence line on the very first morning when she had asked whether he needed help, and he had said in his careful fashion that he could use a second person. "Yes," he said, "I'll marry you." They were married in December, the Saturday before Christmas, in the little church on the main street of Copper Falls that had a pine wood floor and hand-sewn pew cushions and a preacher named Reverend Marsh, who spoke plainly and kept his sermons short, which Clara appreciated on doctrinal grounds. Ellsworth Crane stood with Noah. Margaret Trent stood with Clara. She had come to fill the role so gradually and naturally that no one had needed to formally arrange it. The Crocker family occupied the second and third pews, all six of them, and Thomas Crocker had combed his hair, which Clara regarded as a significant tribute. She wore her best dress, the green one, which had been with her since Boston, and which had seen the inside of Barn Creek Bank and Cattle Chute without complaint, and which she had had let out at the waist because she was not the same size she had been when she arrived, having put on the muscle of actual outdoor work, and she felt no mourning about this. She had pressed it the night before, and she wore it with her mother's earrings and her hair up in the careful way she'd had since she was 20. And when she walked in the church door and saw Noah standing at the altar in a suit that was clearly new, and that he wore with a dignity she found unexpectedly moving, she stopped for just a moment in the doorway. He turned and saw her. She walked the length of the aisle toward him, and she thought about all the distances she had crossed to arrive at this particular moment: the train from Boston, the wagon road from Copper Falls, the longer and less measurable distances that grief and time and the work of rebuilding a life had asked of her. She took her place beside him. "You look well," he said under his breath, which was the most he had to offer in public, and which was enough. "You do too," she said. Reverend Marsh cleared his throat. They turned to face him. The reception was held in the school building because it was the largest space on the ranch, and because Noah had built it and Clara had opened it, and it seemed fitting that it hold the first celebration they would have together on this land. The Alderman family brought pies. The Halversons brought a fiddle and a will to use it. Margaret Trent brought a bottle of brandy that she said she'd been saving for a good occasion and appeared satisfied that this qualified. Crane gave a short speech that was warmly precise the way he was, and ended it by raising his glass to James Whitmore, who had started something he did not know he'd started, and to Harlan Whitmore, who had kept it in trust, and to the woman who had come west to sell a ranch and had instead come home. Clara, sitting at Noah's right hand at the head of a long table that had been made by pushing four of the students' desks together, pressed his hand under the table. He pressed back. The fiddle started up. Thomas Crocker discovered that he could dance, which surprised everyone, including himself, and the younger Crocker children put their shoes on the wrong feet and danced anyway, and Ames wound through the whole crowd, receiving attention he accepted with professional composure. She danced once with Noah, who was a reserved dancer in the way he was a reserved everything, precise and unhurried, and she thought about how extraordinary it was that this was the same man who had stood in a barn doorway in April and told her the water rights on Copper Creek with the flat delivery of a weather report, and how those two men were in fact exactly the same man, and how she had been learning that man for 8 months without quite realizing she was learning to love him. Later, when the fiddle had gone quiet and the guests had gone home and the schoolroom was empty, they cleaned up together in comfortable silence the way they did everything. She washed the glasses. He carried the tables back. Ames slept by the stove. It was very late and very quiet when they went back to the ranch house. The stars overhead in their usual extravagant excess, the cold, clean, and sharp, the snow that had fallen in the week before Christmas, lying blue-white on the ground. She stopped in the yard and looked up. "What are you doing?" he said. "Looking at the stars," she said. "I still haven't gotten used to them." He stopped beside her and looked up. "Good," he said. "I'd worry if you did." She leaned her shoulder against his arm slightly, and he put his arm around her, and they stood in the yard of the Whitmore Ranch in the deep, cold December night and looked at the sky above Montana, which was so full of light that the darkness was almost incidental. The school ran through its first full year and into the second without a pause worth mentioning. By spring, she had 17 students, 2 of them new families who had come to the valley over the winter. The county sent an inspector in March, a dry man from Helena, who had clearly expected something provisional and was visibly surprised by what he found. He stayed 2 hours, watched a spelling lesson and an arithmetic lesson, examined the building, interviewed Clara, spoke briefly with 3 students, and before he left wrote something in his ledger that she was not able to read, but that she chose to take as favorable. She expanded the curriculum in the second year to include geography and natural history, the latter because she had learned enough about this country's geology and biology from living in it that she could teach it with genuine authority, which was the only kind of authority she had ever respected in a teacher. Noah built a second room onto the school in the summer of the second year, anticipating the enrollment she was projecting. He asked her input on the dimensions and the window placement and nothing else because he trusted her assessment of what the room needed to do, and because he was by now confident enough in their collaboration to know where his expertise ended and hers began. Thomas Crocker, who had turned 13 and who had the look of a boy becoming a man in the useful and unglamorous way, had become a regular presence on the ranch on evenings and weekends. He was learning cattle work from Noah with the same focused intensity Clara had seen him bring to long division. She watched the 2 of them sometimes from the kitchen window, the lean, quiet man and the wiry, earnest boy moving through the practical business of the ranch with an ease that was also, she thought, something more than ease. Something like continuity. She did not interfere with it. She simply noted it and felt glad in the way that teachers feel glad when something they have believed about a student turns out to be true. In the second spring, a letter came from Margaret in Boston. "The city is the same," Margaret wrote, "as it always is, which is either comfort or complaint, depending on the day. I had dinner with Mrs. Hatch last week, and she speaks of you with great admiration and some wistfulness, which is, I think, the most she allows herself to feel about things she cannot change. She has hired a very good replacement who the children adore, which I suspect means you would find her a little too cheerful. I am coming to visit in July if you will have me. I have decided the Whitmore Ranch must be real and not simply a very long novel you have been writing me for 2 years. Also, I want to see this man of yours. He sounds improbable." Clara laughed out loud alone at the kitchen table for a good 30 seconds. She wrote back that Margaret was most welcome and that Noah was in fact improbable, but that she had found improbable things were often the most durable. The night before the second anniversary of her arrival in Montana, she found Noah at the writing desk in the parlor. She had come downstairs late for a glass of water and saw the light through the door. She looked in without speaking. He was not reading. He was sitting at the desk with his forearms resting on the surface and his hands loosely clasped, looking at the window, which at this hour was merely a black rectangle reflecting the room's lamplight back at itself. She knew without asking what he was thinking about. She had come to know the texture of his silences the way she knew the texture of the land from prolonged and affectionate attention. She went in and sat in the chair beside the desk. He looked at her. He did not seem surprised. "I was thinking about James," she said. "So was I," he said. They sat with that for a moment. "I think he would have liked this," she said. "Not all of it exactly, but the school, the land being kept, you and me." She paused. "He saw you clearly. He wrote that you were the kind of person you trust without knowing why. I think he would have found it appropriate." Noah was quiet. "He wrote that I wasn't a decent man for a while," he said slowly. "He told me I was, but I knew he meant I was becoming one again." He turned his hands over on the desk, looking at them. Some days I still don't know whether I've made it all the way back. Noah, she said. He looked at her. The man he met in 1890 went into a river in October for a stranger without a second thought, she said. Kept a promise to a dead man for 4 years without being asked. Built a school for children who had no teacher. Saved a filly from colic on a Thursday night. She paused. I think he made it back. He looked at her for a long moment. You always know what to say, he said. I'm a teacher, she said. I know how to tell people what's true. He reached over and took her hand the way he had on the porch that evening with the meadowlark, and she let him hold it in the lamplight of the parlor with James's journal on the shelf above them, and the sound of the creek coming through the window, and the whole of the dark Montana night pressed close around the house. She thought about the letter she had opened in her narrow Boston kitchen, which had contained inside it, folded and sealed, and utterly unguessed at this life. This man, this land that had asked things of her she had not known she was capable of giving, and had given her things in return that she had not known she was still able to want. She thought about second chances. She thought about the particular mercy of not knowing what you were walking toward. She thought about nothing and everything and the sound of the creek. Go to sleep, she said. In a minute, he said. They sat a while longer and the lamp burned and outside the ranch lay still and dark and very much itself. The following July, when Margaret arrived on the train from Billings, Clara was waiting at the depot with Noah and Thomas Crocker and Ames, who was not technically necessary at train stations, but who had developed strong feelings about exclusion. Margaret stepped down from the car and looked at the four of them with an expression that combined assessment and delight in about equal measure, and then she threw her arms around Clara and held on. Well, she said, pulling back and looking at her, you look extraordinary. I look tanned and like I work outside, Clara said. Yes, Margaret said. Extraordinary. She turned to Noah, who was holding the horse's bridle and had removed his hat and was regarding Margaret with the calm patience of a man who expected to be inspected and had decided to let it happen. You, Margaret said, must be the improbable man. I must be, Noah said. Good, said Margaret, and shook his hand with a firmness that clearly surprised him. She needed something real. Margaret, Clara said. I'm being efficient, Margaret said. I only have 3 weeks. She looked around at the depot, at the mountains beyond the town, at the sky. She breathed in and was quiet for a moment. Oh, she said softly. Oh, I see. Clara looked at her. You couldn't have left, Margaret said. No one could leave this. No, Clara agreed. I couldn't. She took Margaret's bag and they walked together toward the buckboard, Noah ahead with the horses and Thomas talking to Ames with the practiced ease of a boy who has discovered that dogs are among the most reliable conversationalists available. And Clara walked beside her oldest friend in the summer morning of her second year in Montana on the road between the depot and the ranch that was her home in the life she had not planned and had come to love with the whole of herself. The mountains stood up against the sky the way they always did, enormous and patient, and entirely without concern for whether she noticed them. She noticed them. 6 months later, in the deep of the Montana winter, when the snow lay in drifts against the barn walls and the stove burned from before dawn to after midnight, she stood in the school and watched 12, now 17 children bent over their work. The scratch of pencils and the occasional whisper, the smell of wood smoke and chalk and cold wool drying near the heat. She had been standing in front of classrooms for 11 years. She had never stood in front of one that felt like this. She was not sure she had the word for it, not happiness exactly, which seemed too small and too specific. Something more like fullness, the sensation of having arrived at the size of your life, of having grown into it entirely. Thomas Crocker was helping the youngest Halverson boy with his letters, bending over his desk with a patience that was entirely self-taught. She watched him for a moment and thought about Noah and thought about how the things people carry, the good things, the real things, have a way of moving forward through other people without ever being declared. She went back to the blackboard. She had a lesson to finish. That evening, she and Noah sat on the porch in the cold, bundled in coats and blankets, their breath making small ghosts in the winter air. The sky above them, the deep navy of a Montana winter night with its incomprehensible freight of stars. They had made a habit of this, sitting on the porch, even in cold weather, because neither of them could quite bring themselves to give the nights up. Clara, he said. Yes, she said. Are you glad? He said. She considered it honestly the way she considered everything. Yes, she said. That's enough, he said. More than enough, she said. The night was quiet around them. Below the ridge, the creek ran under its skin of ice, still moving the way creeks do, even in the coldest months, finding the way through steady and unremarkable and entirely reliable. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The stars blazed overhead in their impossible, uncountable thousands. This was Montana. This was home. This was the life that had been waiting in a letter she had opened at a kitchen table in Boston in the spring of 1894, while the city went about its ordinary business outside the window, and she sat alone in the lamplight reading. She had folded the letter. She had gone to bed. She had risen in the morning and bought a train ticket west. And she had never not once been sorry.